This year is not even halfway done, and it has already been one of the most remarkable years for archaeology in recent memory. A lost city founded by Alexander the Great has been pulled back from obscurity beneath the deserts of southern Iraq. A hidden chamber on the west bank of the Nile has given up 22 painted coffins belonging to women who sang for the gods. A submerged landscape beneath the North Sea has revealed forests that should not have been there, stretching back 16,000 years. And in the jungles of Mexico, a cave system has offered up human remains from a world that existed long before anyone built a temple or wrote a word down. Tonight we are covering 12 of the biggest archaeological stories of the year so far. We are going from Iraq to Mexico, from the floors of the North Sea to the highlands of Greece, from ancient Egypt to the frozen plains of Siberia. The discoveries range from lost cities and royal coffins to the oldest wooden tools ever found, and a new answer to one of the oldest questions in human prehistory. The year is not finished, more is coming, but what has already happened is more than enough to spend an evening with. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's get into it. In the flat, sun-baked desert of southern Iraq, not far from the Iranian border, a low ridge rises above the plain. From a distance, it looks like a natural feature of the landscape, the kind of thing you would note and move past without a second thought. But that ridge is not natural, it is a city wall. And behind it, buried beneath the dust of nearly 2,000 years, lies one of the most significant urban sites ever found in the ancient Near East. In February, a team led by Professor Stefan Hauser of the University of Konstanz in Germany, working alongside British archaeologists Jane Moon, Robert Killick, and Stuart Campbell, formally confirmed what years of painstaking non-invasive survey work had been building toward. The ruins at Jebel Kayaber in southern Iraq are the remains of Alexandria on the Tigris, a port city founded by Alexander the Great himself in 324 BC. It had been lost to the modern world for the better part of 2 millennia. Now it has been found. The scale of what the team uncovered is striking. The city covers roughly 2.5 square miles. Its walls rise up to 26 feet above the surrounding plain in places, still clearly visible despite centuries of neglect. Using drone photography, cesium magnetometer geophysical surveys, and systematic surface surveys across 500 square kilometers, the team mapped the interior of the city without disturbing a single stone. What emerged from the data was a planned urban center of remarkable size and complexity. Wide streets laid out on a grid, massive residential blocks that, according to Hauser, surpass even those of Seleucia, one of the great imperial capitals of the ancient world in their scale. Temple compounds, workshop districts with evidence of kilns and smelting, canals, harbor basins, an entire ancient city sitting just below the surface, waiting. To understand why this discovery matters, it helps to understand who Alexandria on the Tigris was built for and what it was built to do. When Alexander returned to Mesopotamia from his campaigns in the Indus Valley around 324 BC, he recognized a problem. Sedimentation in the river systems of southern Mesopotamia had gradually rendered older harbors unusable. The coastline and the waterways were shifting, and the existing port infrastructure could not keep up. Alexander's solution was to found a new city, positioned at the confluence of the Tigris and Karun rivers, right at the point where inland river traffic from across Mesopotamia could connect with sea routes through the Persian Gulf and the trade networks reaching toward India and Central Asia. It was, in other words, a gateway city, a purpose-built hub designed to sit at the intersection of the ancient world's most important commercial arteries. And for a very long time, it worked. The city that Alexander founded eventually came to be known as Charax-Spasinu, named after a local ruler who rebuilt and expanded it following flood damage, and then as Antiocheia in Susiana under later rulers. Under those names, it functioned as a major political and economic center for over 550 years. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder referenced the city in the 1st century AD, drawing on even older accounts. It appeared in the records of traders, geographers, and historians from across the ancient world. It was not a footnote. It was one of the central nodes in the commercial network connecting Rome, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. The Arsacid Empire, better known as the Parthian Empire, which controlled much of the Near East from roughly 250 BC to 226 AD, used the city as a key provincial center. And this is where an important gap in historical knowledge comes in. The Parthian Empire was, for most of its existence, one of the most powerful states in the world, the great eastern counterpart to Rome, with whom it traded, competed, and occasionally went to war for centuries. Yet it remains one of the least studied major empires of antiquity. The period between the end of cuneiform writing and the advent of Islam has, as Hauser himself has noted, been sidelined by academic disciplines that developed with their attention pointed elsewhere. Alexandria on the Tigris, as the capital of one of the Arsacid Empire's core provinces, has the potential to fill a significant part of that gap. The city's eventual decline was not the result of conquest or catastrophe, but of geography. Rivers in southern Mesopotamia shift course over time, pushed by sediment accumulation and the slow movement of the land itself. By the 3rd century AD, the Tigris had migrated westward far enough to cut the city off from direct access to the main channel. Without that connection, the harbor lost its function. River shipping declined. The economic base that had sustained the city for centuries weakened, and most of its population left. By late antiquity, Alexandria on the Tigris had faded from the world's memory. Its commercial role passed to Basra, which grew into the region's primary port and has remained significant ever since. The modern story of the site's rediscovery begins in the 1960s, when British researcher John Hansman was reviewing Royal Air Force aerial photographs of the region and noticed something. A large walled enclosure, traces of settlement, the outlines of something significant, buried in the flat landscape near the border with Iran. Hansman made the connection between what he was seeing in the photographs and ancient descriptions of Alexandria on the Tigris, but field research stalled almost immediately. The Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s turned the border zone into a military landscape. Armed forces built installations across parts of the ruins. The site was inaccessible for decades. It was not until 2014 that a team of British researchers, traveling under tight security and at considerable personal risk, were granted access to revisit Hansman's original identification. What they found on the ground confirmed that the low ridge visible in the old photographs was indeed a city wall, stretching for more than a kilometer with sections still standing. The scale pointed immediately to a major urban center. Stefan Hauser joined the project in 2016, bringing geophysical expertise and a deep knowledge of post-cuneiform Near Eastern archaeology to what became the formal Charax-Spasinu project. For years, with ISIS controlling parts of northern Iraq and the broader security situation remaining difficult, the team conducted only non-invasive research: drone flights, magnetometer surveys, surface collection, all of it done under armed guard. The results, formally published and announced in February 2026, represent the culmination of that long and complicated process. The city that emerged from the data is not a modest outpost or a regional backwater. It is a metropolis, carefully planned, densely built, and connected to the wider ancient world in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. The residential blocks alone, according to Hauser, are extraordinary in their scale, larger than those found in Seleucia, which was itself one of the largest cities of the ancient world at its height. Full excavation of the site remains on hold. The Israeli and American military operations against Iran in early 2026 led to the closure of Iraqi airspace, forcing the postponement of a planned geophysical campaign that had been scheduled for that year. Hauser is hoping conditions will allow the team to return in autumn 2026, but the situation remains uncertain. When excavation does eventually become possible, the buried city that lies just below the surface at Jebel Kayaber will almost certainly have more to say. For now, the confirmation alone is significant enough. a city that Alexander the Great built with his own strategic vision, that served as a hub of global commerce for over half a millennium, and that then disappeared so completely that its location was debated by scholars for centuries, has been found. It is sitting in the desert of southern Iraq, walls still standing, streets still laid out beneath the soil, waiting for the day when the ground can finally be opened. Iraq is not the only place where the ground gave something up this year. On the other side of the ancient world, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, a team of Egyptian archaeologists broke into a rock-cut chamber and found themselves looking at something that had not been seen for over 2,000 years. In late February, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities announced the find, made during excavations in the Kurna area of Luxor's west bank, part of the Asasif necropolis, that spreads across the hillside opposite the temples of Karnak. The joint mission, run by the Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Zahi Hawass Foundation for Archaeology and Heritage, had been digging in the courtyard of a tomb belonging to a man named Seneb when they came across the entrance to a rectangular chamber cut straight into the rock. What was inside stopped them in their tracks. 22 painted wooden coffins stacked in 10 horizontal rows, with the lids separated from the bases, to fit as many as possible into the space. The people who arranged them had packed the chamber carefully and efficiently. Most of the coffins still held mummified remains inside, and that detail matters more than it might seem at first. The era these burials date to was a troubled time in Egypt, and a large number of elite burials from this period were broken into, looted or moved at some point in the ancient past. Walking into a chamber with the mummies still inside is not something the team would have taken for granted. Alongside the coffins, the team found pottery vessels used during the mummification process and a large ceramic jar holding 8 papyri of different sizes. Some of them still had their original clay seals intact, meaning nobody has read what is written inside since they were placed in that jar and sealed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Field Director Afifi Rahim called them an informational treasure. Their contents will not be known until the restoration and translation work is complete, and that will take time. But the anticipation around them is significant. The coffins themselves carry an interesting detail. Most of them do not have personal names on them. Instead, they have titles, and the title that shows up again and again across that chamber is Singers of Amun, sometimes translated as Chanters of Amun. To understand what that means, it helps to know a little about the world these women lived in. The burials date to what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, running from around 1077 to 664 BC, covering the 21st through to the 25th dynasties. It came after the New Kingdom, the era of Rameses the Great, and it was a time when Egypt's central power had broken down. The country was split between competing centers, with a ruling class based at Tanis in the north and another power base at Thebes in the south. The unified Egypt that the great pharaohs had built was gone, at least for now. Through all of that, one thing stayed strong at Thebes. The cult of Amun, based at the great temple complex of Karnak, kept its grip on Upper Egypt throughout this entire period. The high priests of Amun were not just religious figures. They held real political power, and at times effectively ran the region in their own right. Karnak was not simply a place of worship. It was a major landowner, an employer of vast numbers of people, an economic force, and the center of the most important ceremonies in southern Egypt. Within that world, the Singers of Amun held a role that was far more important than the title might suggest to someone hearing it today. These were high-status women, usually from priestly families or the most respected families in Thebes, who took part directly in temple ceremonies. They used instruments like the sistrum, a type of rattle connected to the goddess Hathor, and the menat, a heavy beaded necklace shaken rhythmically during ritual. Temple music in ancient Egypt was not background sound or decoration. It was seen as a direct way of communicating with the gods, of keeping them content and maintaining the order that Egyptian religion was built around. The women who performed it were a functioning part of the temple, not a sideshow to it. Their status showed in how they were remembered. Chantresses of Amun appear in tomb paintings, in inscriptions, and in administrative records, going back through the New Kingdom and into this later period. They came from powerful families and wore their titles with pride, having them carved onto their coffins and funerary objects as one of the most important things to be said about them in death. The fact that the Kurna coffins carry these titles rather than personal names suggests that what these women did was seen, at least in the context of burial, as more important than who they individually were. The chamber itself was almost certainly a secondary burial, meaning the coffins were brought here from somewhere else rather than being placed here as part of an original burial. This was a well-documented practice during the Third Intermediate Period, and to understand why it happened, you need a picture of what was going on across the Theban necropolis at the time. Tomb robbery was a serious and widespread problem. Royal burials that had stood for centuries were being broken into and stripped, and the priests who looked after the necropolis began gathering vulnerable mummies and moving them to safer places. The most famous example of this is the Deir el-Bahari cache, found in 1881, which turned out to contain the mummies of dozens of New Kingdom pharaohs that priests had quietly collected and re-hidden centuries after their original burials. The Kurna chamber appears to be the same kind of operation, carried out for a group of temple women rather than kings, but driven by exactly the same need to protect the dead during a time when the normal order had broken down. The original tombs these coffins came from have not been found yet. Excavations are continuing in the area around the chamber in an attempt to locate them, and finding them may fill in more of the story of who these women were and how they ended up here. For now, the biggest unknown is still the papyri. 8 scrolls, sealed and unread for up to 3,000 years, found inside a single jar in a room full of the dead. They could hold funerary spells written for these specific women. They could contain hymns to Amun of the kind performed at Karnak. They could be administrative records, or they could contain something unexpected. Egyptian papyri have a long track record of turning up material that changes what researchers thought they knew about the periods they come from. Until the restoration work is done and the texts can actually be read, the Kurna papyri are one of the most interesting things waiting to be opened in Egyptology right now. While archaeologists were making headlines in Egypt and Iraq, a very different kind of discovery was unfolding in a university laboratory in England. No dig site, no excavation trench, no dramatic moment of a chamber being opened. Just a team of scientists working through genetic data pulled from mud on the floor of the North Sea, and a finding that quietly rewrote a significant chapter of European prehistory. In March, a study led by Professor Robin Allaby of the University of Warwick was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The full team included researchers from multiple institutions, among them Professor Vincent Gaffney of the University of Bradford, one of the world's leading experts on submerged prehistoric landscapes. What they had been studying was Doggerland, the large landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe across what is now the southern North Sea. And what they found there was not what anyone expected. Most people who have heard of Doggerland know the basic outline. It was a stretch of land that existed during and after the last ice age, connecting Britain to the European continent before rising sea levels gradually swallowed it, creating the North Sea in the process. For most of the 20th century, it was thought of primarily as a land bridge, a route that early humans used to move between Britain and Europe before the water cut them off. Useful, in other words, but not particularly remarkable in its own right. The new study changes that picture considerably. The team's method involves something called sedimentary ancient DNA, or ceta-DNA. Rather than digging into the seabed or recovering physical artifacts, they extracted genetic material preserved in mud samples taken from the floor of the North Sea. In total, they analyzed 252 samples from 41 marine cores drilled along a prehistoric river system known as the Southern River, which once flowed through what is now the southern part of Doggerland. The sediments along this system had accumulated over thousands of years and preserved fragments of ancient DNA from the plants and trees that once grew along its banks. By working through those fragments, the team was able to reconstruct what the landscape looked like from roughly 16,000 years ago until the land finally disappeared beneath the sea. What they found was a forested landscape. Not tundra, not a cold and windswept plain, but a genuine temperate woodland, with oak, elm, and hazel already established more than 16,000 years ago. That is thousands of years earlier than British pollen records had suggested trees of this kind were present in the region. They also found lime trees, a species that prefers warmer conditions, appearing around 2,000 years earlier than they show up in records from mainland Britain. And then there was the most unexpected find of all: DNA from a genus called Pterocarya, a relative of the walnut tree, a species that was believed to have vanished from northwestern Europe around 400,000 years ago. It was there in the sediment, surviving apparently in sheltered pockets of the landscape long after it was supposed to have disappeared entirely. To understand why all of this matters, it helps to know a bit about how the scientific community has thought about northern Europe at the end of the Ice Age. When the glaciers began retreating, roughly 20,000 years ago, the expectation would be that it took a long time for forests to re-establish themselves across the landscape. Trees spread slowly. Seeds disperse over limited distances. Moving a forest hundreds of miles northward across a recovering landscape should, by that logic, take a very long time. And yet the fossil record from Britain and northern Europe shows forests appearing surprisingly quickly after the Ice Age ended. This has puzzled researchers for well over a century and has been given a name, Reed's paradox, after the botanist Clement Reed, who first identified the problem in the early 20th century. How did the forests get there so fast? The Doggerland findings offer a significant part of the answer. If Doggerland was already forested 16,000 years ago, while much of Britain and northern Europe was still emerging from glacial conditions, then those forests did not need to travel far at all. As the ice retreated and the climate warmed, the trees were already there, in the sheltered river valleys and lowlands of Doggerland, ready to spread. The landscape acted as what researchers call a refugium, a protected pocket where species survived the harshest conditions and then expanded outward when conditions improved. This is not a minor footnote. It is a direct answer to one of the longest standing puzzles in the study of European plant life. Doggerland itself had been known as a concept since the early 20th century, named after the Dogger Bank, the shallow area of the North Sea where fishing boats had periodically hauled up surprising objects in their nets: mammoth bones, antlers. In 1931, a trawler working in the area brought up something particularly striking: a barbed bone harpoon that was subsequently identified as belonging to the Maglemosian culture, a Mesolithic people known to have been active in northern Europe from around 10,300 years ago. That harpoon, known as the Kalinda harpoon after the boat that found it, became one of the most famous pieces of evidence that the now submerged North Sea floor was once home to real human communities. The new study adds depth to that picture. If Doggerland was a forested, resource-rich landscape 16,000 years ago, it was not just a crossing point for migrating humans. It was a place where people could have lived, hunted, and built communities for thousands of years before the sea arrived. The forests would have supported wild boar, deer, and other animals. The rivers would have provided fish. The same kinds of ecological conditions that supported Mesolithic cultures across northern Europe were present in Doggerland long before they appeared on what is now dry land in Britain or Scandinavia. This raises a direct question about the relatively thin archaeological record for early Mesolithic communities in Britain. If the richest and most habitable parts of the landscape were in Doggerland, and Doggerland is now under 60 meters of water, then the evidence of those early communities went down with it. The Storegga tsunami, triggered by a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway around 8,150 years ago, has long been discussed as a possible final blow to whatever remained of Doggerland by that point. The new study suggests that parts of the landscape survived even that event, with some areas remaining above water until as recently as 7,000 years ago, later than most previous estimates had suggested. The ctDNA technique used in this research is now being applied to other submerged prehistoric landscapes, including areas of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, both of which were significantly different environments during the Ice Age, and both of which may have supported human communities that are now entirely underwater. What the Doggerland study demonstrated is that the genetic information preserved in seafloor sediments can tell a detailed story about landscapes that are otherwise completely inaccessible. It is, in practical terms, a way of doing archaeology without being able to dig. Questions remain. The northern extent of Doggerland is still not well understood, and it is unclear whether the forested conditions found in the south extended across the whole landmass, or whether the northern sections were more open and tundra-like. And the direct evidence for human presence in Doggerland itself remains extremely limited, for the obvious reason that the sites are underwater. Short of a major investment in underwater excavation, which presents enormous practical and financial challenges, those communities may remain largely invisible. But the picture of Doggerland that this study has produced is a long way from the bare land bridge of older textbooks. It was a living, forested, ecologically rich world that sat at the heart of Northern Europe for thousands of years, and the people who lived there are only now beginning to get the attention they deserve. The discoveries we have covered so far have all involved physical things: cities, coffins, submerged forests, things you can point to on a map. This next one is different. It is a study that took a question the scientific community has been arguing about for decades and approached it from a completely new angle. And the answer it came back with is not what most people would expect. In February, a team led by Professor Ariane Burke of the University of Montreal, head of the Hominin Dispersals Research Group, published a study in Quaternary Science Reviews. Her co-authors were Emma Pomeroy, Timothy Poiseau, Benjamin Albuy, and Simon Paquin. The question they set out to answer was one of the oldest in human prehistory. Why did the Neanderthals disappear? This is not a new question. Researchers have been working on it for well over a century, and the debate around it has produced a long list of competing theories, none of which has ever fully satisfied the evidence. But what Burke and her team brought to the problem was a method borrowed from a completely different field. Rather than going through the fossil record and the stone tools in the traditional way, they adapted a type of modeling normally used in conservation biology to study how animal and plant populations survive or collapse when their habitat becomes fragmented. They then applied it to archaeological and climate data from the period known as marine isotope stage 3, roughly 60,000 to 35,000 years ago. That is the window of time when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were sharing Europe, and when the Neanderthals were running out of time. Before getting into what the model showed, it is worth taking a moment to establish just how long Neanderthals had actually been around. They had lived in Europe and Western Asia for roughly 300,000 years. In that time, they came through multiple ice ages and climate swings far more extreme than anything the period of their extinction threw at them. They were not a fragile or unsophisticated species. Research over the past few decades has steadily revised the older picture of Neanderthals as simple brutes, making clear that they were capable of producing complex tools, using adhesives to attach tool components to handles, applying pigments to their bodies or objects, and displaying what looks very much like symbolic behavior. They buried their dead, they cared for their injured, and when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, the genetic record shows the two groups did not simply avoid each other. They met, spent time together, and in some cases, had children. Modern humans outside Africa carry somewhere between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA as a direct result of those encounters tens of thousands of years ago. So a species that had endured for 300,000 years, that was technologically capable, socially complex, and actively interbreeding with incoming modern humans, simply vanished from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. The standard explanations have never quite held up to scrutiny. The idea that Homo sapiens hunted them to extinction does not fit the timeline or the population numbers involved. Pure climate collapse does not work either, because the Neanderthals had come through far worse climates before without disappearing. Disease brought by Homo sapiens is possible in theory, but extremely difficult to test with the evidence available. And none of these single-factor explanations account for the fact that the disappearance played out differently in different parts of Europe, with different timings, different sequences of events, and different apparent pressures depending on which region you look at. Something more complicated was going on, and the field has known it for a long time. This is exactly where Burke's approach becomes useful. Rather than asking what force or event killed the Neanderthals, the study asked a more structural question. What did the landscape look like for them during this period? How was their suitable habitat distributed across Europe? How well connected were the best areas of that habitat to each other? And how did that compare to the habitat situation facing Homo sapiens at the same time? The results were striking. The regions that provided good living conditions for Homo sapiens were well connected across Europe, forming a broad and relatively coherent network from west to east. The regions that suited Neanderthals were more broken up, particularly between Western and Eastern Europe, where there were meaningful gaps in the quality and connectivity of the habitat between the two areas. In very practical terms, this difference had serious consequences. When a group of Homo sapiens took a hit from a harsh winter, a disease outbreak, or a string of bad hunts, there were likely other groups within reachable distance who could help. New people arriving from connected communities brought fresh genetic diversity, new knowledge, and additional numbers. The network absorbed the shock and recovered. When the same thing happened to a Neanderthal group, especially in Eastern Europe where the fragmentation of habitat was most severe, there may simply have been no one close enough to help. The group would shrink, lose genetic diversity over generations, and gradually weaken, with no mechanism to replenish itself. No single catastrophe needed to finish them off. The isolation and the slow accumulation of pressure was enough on its own over a long enough period. In Western Europe, the picture was different again. Here, the habitats of the two groups overlapped more directly, which means Homo sapiens may have played a more active role in pushing local Neanderthal populations back through direct competition for the same resources in the same areas. Food, shelter, territory, the two species were competing for the same things in the same landscapes, and Homo sapiens, with their better connected networks and larger effective population sizes, had the edge. In Eastern Europe, the pattern was different. There, the increasing isolation of Neanderthal groups likely led not to direct replacement, but to something slower, gradual absorption into the Homo sapiens gene pool through interbreeding over many generations. That process would explain both the presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans outside Africa and the eventual disappearance of genetically distinct Neanderthal communities in those regions without requiring any dramatic confrontation. What the study describes, taken as a whole, is not a single extinction event with a single cause. It is a slow, regional process, a patchwork of different things happening in different places over thousands of years, all arriving at the same endpoint, but through different routes, depending on where you look. Climate instability contributed, direct competition contributed, genetic absorption contributed, isolation contributed, but the factor that determined how much of any of this a given Neanderthal population could handle was, more than anything else, how well connected it was to other groups of its own kind. Groups that were part of a functioning network had options. Groups that were isolated did not. This represents a meaningful shift in the way the question gets framed. The debate about Neanderthal extinction has historically focused on external forces, on what hit them, what came from outside and overwhelmed them. Burke's study turns that question around and looks at the internal structure of Neanderthal society and the degree to which that structure, through no particular fault of anyone, left them exposed when multiple pressures arrived at the same time. Homo sapiens, with their broader and better connected networks stretching across the continent, were simply better positioned to absorb those same pressures and keep recovering. It was not necessarily that Homo sapiens were smarter, stronger, or more determined. They were more connected, and in the long run, that made the difference. The modeling approach the team developed is already being applied to other questions about early human movement and dispersal, looking at how different populations responded to changing environments across much longer timescales. Ongoing ancient DNA research into Neanderthal population structure is also expected to refine the connectivity picture further as sequencing technology continues to improve and more Neanderthal genomes become available for analysis. Questions do remain, particularly around whether direct violence between the two species played a meaningful role in specific regions at specific times, something that the modeling approach cannot easily address, and that the physical evidence alone has never been able to settle. For now, though, the study gives us the most complete picture yet of why a species that had lasted 300,000 years in Europe could not hold on through this particular stretch of time. It was not one thing that finished them. It was the weight of multiple pressures, landing on populations that, because of where they lived and how their world was structured, had less room than their neighbors to absorb any of it. From the cold plains of Ice Age Europe, we move to the mountains of southern Mexico. And from a question that has haunted science for over a century, we move to a tomb that was only just opened, and to a discovery that stopped the archaeologists who found it. In January, researchers announced the discovery of a 1,400-year-old Zapotec tomb in the municipality of San Pablo Huitzo in the state of Oaxaca. The find was reported by Christina Kilgrove at Live Science and by Jack Guy at CNN, and it quickly drew attention far beyond the usual circles of Mesoamerican archaeology. Not because of the tomb itself, though the tomb is significant, because of what was inside it. Dominating the burial chamber was an enormous owl sculpture, not a small ceramic figure of the kind that turns up regularly in Zapotec excavations, but a large, carefully crafted representation of an owl placed in a position that would have been immediately visible to anyone entering the space. Around it were human remains and associated grave goods, the material record of a burial that clearly belonged to someone of considerable importance. Alongside the owl, the chamber contained the kinds of objects that mark elite Zapotec burials: worked ceramics, personal items and offerings placed with the dead for use in whatever came after. To understand why an owl in a tomb matters this much, you need to know something about the Zapotec world and what the owl meant within it. The Zapotec civilization is one of the oldest complex societies in the Americas. Its roots go back to around 500 BC, with the founding of Monte Alban, a city built on a flattened mountaintop overlooking the valley of Oaxaca in what is now the southern Mexican state of the same name. Monte Alban was one of the first true cities anywhere in the Americas, planned and constructed on a scale that required serious political organization and a large, coordinated population to achieve. From there, Zapotec civilization grew over the following centuries into one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The Zapotecs developed their own writing system, one of the earliest in the Americas, as well as their own calendar and a detailed understanding of astronomy. They were active traders and diplomats, maintaining contact with Teotihuacan, the enormous city in the Valley of Mexico that was at its height between roughly 100 and 500 AD, and which dominated much of Mesoamerican political and cultural life during that period. Teotihuacan at its peak was one of the largest cities in the world, and the Zapotecs were connected to it. Oaxacan ceramic styles show up in Teotihuacan, and Teotihuacan influences appear in Oaxacan material culture. These were not isolated regional societies. They were part of a connected world. The tomb at San Pablo Huitzo dates to approximately 600 AD, placing it in what historians call the early classic period of Zapotec civilization, roughly the 6th and 7th centuries AD. This was a time of real cultural confidence and political strength for the Zapotecs. Monte Alban was functioning as a major urban center, the surrounding valleys were densely settled, and Zapotec art and architecture were being produced at a high level. It was also, based on the evidence from sites across the Oaxacan region, a period when elite burial practices were particularly elaborate, with the ruling and priestly classes investing heavily in the way their dead were commemorated and the world they were sent into. Zapotec religion placed enormous weight on what happened after death. Ancestor veneration was central to Zapotec belief, with the dead remaining active and significant presences in the lives of the living. Elite tombs were not simply places to put bodies. They were carefully designed spaces that served a religious function, connecting the world of the living to the world of the dead in a way that maintained the ancestors' ongoing relevance and power. The ceramic urns that appear in Zapotec burials almost always depict deities or ancestor figures, not as decoration, but as functional objects, vessels through which the dead could be addressed and the gods acknowledged. The finest examples of this tradition are found at Monte Alban itself, where the elaborate underground tombs of Zapotec rulers represent some of the most impressive funerary architecture anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. Within this tradition, the owl carried a specific and powerful meaning. Across Mesoamerican cultures more broadly, owls were associated with the night, with death, and with the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. They were messengers, guardians, and symbols of the power that existed in the dark and the unseen. In Zapotec belief specifically, the owl was closely linked to the underworld and to the forces that governed death and what came after it. Finding an owl of this scale placed deliberately at the center of a burial chamber is not a coincidence or a casual artistic choice. It is a statement about who this person was and what their relationship to the forces of death and the afterlife was understood to be. The size and quality of the sculpture is what makes this find stand out even within the well-documented tradition of Zapotec funerary art. Zapotec elite tombs are known to contain impressive objects, but the sheer scale of the owl at San Pablo Huitzo points to an individual of significant status, someone whose burial warranted a level of investment and craft that went beyond what most elite Zapotecs received. Who exactly this person was has not yet been established. The analysis of the human remains and grave goods is ongoing, and researchers are working to build a picture of the individual's identity, age, sex, and role within Zapotec society. That work takes time, and the results will add considerably to what is already a striking find. San Pablo Huitzo itself is not one of the most famous Zapotec sites. It sits in the broader Oaxacan region that has produced important finds over many decades, but it has not received the same level of sustained excavation as Monte Alban or some of the other major centers. The discovery of a tomb of this quality, there is a reminder that the Oaxacan Valley and its surrounding areas contain a great deal that has not yet been uncovered. Wider excavation of the San Pablo Huitzo site is planned, and given what the first tomb has produced, the expectation is that the surrounding area will have more to offer. What this find adds to the broader record of Zapotec archaeology is a well-preserved and visually powerful example of elite burial practice, from a period that is already considered one of the high points of Zapotec cultural life. The owl sculpture in particular contributes to ongoing research into how the Zapotecs used death imagery in the context of political and religious power, how the symbols associated with the underworld and the afterlife were deployed by the elite to communicate status, authority, and a special relationship with the forces that governed life and death. In cultures where the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a permeable threshold, being buried with an enormous owl was not just a religious act. It was a claim about who you were and where you stood in the order of things. The tomb at San Pablo Huitzo is one of the most visually striking Mesoamerican finds of the year. The analysis of what it contains is still in its early stages, and the full story of the person buried there has not yet been told. But what has already come out of that chamber is enough to make it one of the standout discoveries of 2026 so far. We are staying in Mexico for this next one, but we are moving forward in time by about 800 years, from the Zapotec world of Oaxaca to the heart of the most powerful empire in pre-Columbian North America. And from a tomb in the mountains, we move to the center of a city that once held hundreds of thousands of people, now buried beneath the streets of modern Mexico City. In late February, Heritage Daily reported a major find at Templo, the great ceremonial pyramid that stood at the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. Excavations at the site had uncovered 3 stone chests, and inside them, a remarkable collection of objects. over 80 greenstone figurines in the Mescala style, alongside around 4,000 marine specimens, coral, shells, and other material from the sea, all placed together in what researchers identified as a single deliberate ritual offering. The offering has been linked to the reign of Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, better known as Moctezuma I, who ruled the Aztec Empire from around 1440 to 1469 AD. To understand what makes this find significant, it helps to know what Templo Mayor actually was and what it meant to the people who built it. Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325 on a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the high valley of central Mexico. Over the following 2 centuries, through military conquest, political alliance, and sheer organizational force, the Aztecs turned that island settlement into one of the largest cities in the world. By the time Spanish forces arrived in 1519, Tenochtitlan had somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people living in it, making it bigger than any city in Europe at the time. The lake around it had been reshaped with causeways, aqueducts, and artificial islands, and it was a remarkable feat of planning and construction by any measure. At the physical and symbolic center of all of it stood Templo Mayor. The temple was a dual pyramid with 2 shrines at its summit, each dedicated to a different deity. The southern shrine belonged to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun and the patron deity of the Aztec people, the divine force the empire credited with its military success. The northern shrine was dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and agricultural fertility, whose favor kept the crops growing and the population fed through the seasons. Together, the 2 shrines represented the 2 foundations the Aztec state was built on: warfare and sustenance, conquest and food, and the temple itself was a physical expression of that balance sitting at the very center of the city. The temple was also rebuilt repeatedly over the years, with each major ruler adding a new outer layer over the existing structure, making it taller and grander as a statement of their reign. Archaeologists working at the site today move through these layers one at a time, and each layer connects to a specific ruler and a specific period in Aztec history. The 3 stone chests from the latest find belong to the construction phase associated with Moctezuma I, who stands as one of the most consequential figures in the early history of the empire. During his reign, the Aztec military pushed aggressively across central Mexico, drawing new territories under Tenochtitlan's control and establishing the tributary system that would sustain the empire for the decades that followed. He also oversaw significant expansions of Templo Mayor itself, and the offering uncovered in this excavation belongs to that period of growth and ambition. The contents of the 3 chests tell a layered story about how the Aztecs understood power and their relationship to the world around them. The marine specimens are the more straightforward part of the picture. Coral, shells, and sea-based material appear in many of the offering deposits found at Templo Mayor over the years, and their meaning within Aztec belief is reasonably well understood. The ocean represented the boundary of the known world in Aztec cosmology, the place where creation began and where the forces of fertility and abundance had their origin. Bringing material from the sea to the center of the city and placing it inside the most sacred structure in the empire was a way of drawing that cosmic power inward, connecting Tenochtitlan to the edges of the world. 4,000 marine specimens in a single offering is a very considerable investment in that idea, and it points to a ritual act that was planned at the highest level. The greenstone figurines are more interesting and in some ways more revealing about how the Aztec state thought about itself and its place in history. The Mescala culture flourished in what is now the state of Guerrero in southwestern Mexico, somewhere between 2,000 and 500 years before the Aztec period, producing a distinctive style of stone figurine with abstract human forms and simplified facial features, carved from greenstone with considerable skill. By the time the Aztecs were building their empire, the Mescala culture had been gone for centuries. These were not contemporary objects. They were ancient things from a world that had long since disappeared, and the Aztecs were deliberately seeking them out. This practice of collecting ancient objects from older cultures and depositing them as sacred offerings within Templo is documented across many different excavation phases at the site. Olmec figures, objects connected to Teotihuacan, material from civilizations that had risen and fallen long before the Aztec state existed, all of it appears in the offering layers beneath the temple. Researchers have spent years working through what this habit reveals about Aztec thinking, and the most widely accepted interpretation is that these ancient objects were seen as vessels of accumulated sacred power, built up over centuries of use and veneration by the cultures that made them. By gathering them from across Mesoamerica and placing them at the heart of their own religious practice, the Aztecs were in effect claiming that accumulated power for themselves, connecting the empire to the deep history of the region and presenting Tenochtitlan as the rightful heir to everything that had come before it in the ancient world. Finding over 80 Mezcala figurines together in a single deposit, linked directly to Moctezuma I, is the largest concentration of this type of material found in a single context at Templo Mayor. It points to something organized and intentional at the level of the imperial court, a ritual act that required identifying, gathering, and transporting a significant collection of ancient objects, and then placing them with thousands of marine specimens inside the holiest structure in the empire. Whatever message was being delivered to the gods by that act, it was one that somebody in Tenochtitlan considered important enough to go to considerable lengths to send. Templo Mayor has been under continuous excavation since 1978, when construction workers digging in the center of Mexico City broke through into the site and uncovered a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered body of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui. That discovery triggered one of the longest-running urban excavation projects in the world, and it has kept producing major finds across the decades since. The layers of the temple that are still being worked through hold offerings from multiple reigns, and the expectation among the excavation team is that further significant deposits are still waiting to be found beneath the surface. The marine specimens from this latest discovery are currently being analyzed to determine exactly where in the ancient world they came from, which will help build a clearer picture of how far the Aztec trade and tribute networks actually reached at the height of the empire's power. We have spent the last few sections in Mexico, and we are not done there yet, because in early March, a discovery was announced that takes us to a completely different part of the country, not a pyramid or a tomb cut into a hillside, but a cave system sitting under the water and a set of human remains that have been there for 8,000 years. The Yucatan Peninsula in southeastern Mexico is home to one of the most extensive underwater cave networks in the world, known as the Sistema de los Cenotes. Cenotes are natural sinkholes, openings in the limestone bedrock that connect down into a vast web of flooded underground passages, stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the jungle floor. To the ancient Maya, who lived above them, these openings in the earth were sacred places, portals to Xibalba, the underworld of Maya belief, where the gods of death held their domain. They were sites of offering, ceremony, and religious significance for centuries. But long before the Maya arrived, long before anyone built a temple or developed a writing system in this part of the world, other people were moving through these caves, and they left traces behind them that the water has been preserving ever since. In March, Heritage Daily reported the announcement of a prehistoric human skeleton found within the submerged cave system, representing a burial site approximately 8,000 years old. The skeleton is one of the oldest human burials ever recovered from within the Yucatan cave network, and it adds a significant new piece of evidence to a picture of early human occupation in this region that researchers have been slowly building for decades. To understand the significance of finding human remains this old in an underwater cave, you need to understand how the caves came to be underwater in the first place. During the last ice age and for several thousand years afterward, sea levels across the world were significantly lower than they are today because so much of the planet's water was locked up in the great ice sheets that covered large parts of the northern hemisphere. In the Yucatan, this meant the cave systems were dry. They were not flooded passages accessible only to cave divers with specialist equipment. They were open caves, dark and cool, but physically accessible to anyone willing to walk into them. Early humans living on the peninsula used them, sheltered in them, and in some cases died and were buried in them. As the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, sea levels rose gradually over thousands of years, and the water crept into the caves from below, flooding the passages and sealing everything inside. The bones, the tools, and the remains of the people who had been there were preserved in the cold, dark, oxygen-poor water, waiting. The Yucatan caves have given up extraordinary finds over the past few decades, as cave divers and researchers have begun systematically exploring the passages. The most famous of these is Naya, a largely complete human skeleton discovered in 2007 in a cave called Hoyo Negro, the Black Hole, in the eastern Yucatan. Naya was dated to between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, making her one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in the Americas. The analysis of her remains produced findings that genuinely complicated the existing picture of how and when the Americas were first populated. Her skull shape and physical characteristics differed in certain ways from those of later Native American populations, raising questions about the relationship between the earliest Americans and the people who came after them. DNA analysis eventually confirmed that she was genetically related to modern Native Americans despite those physical differences, but the broader questions her discovery raised about early American migration have never been fully resolved. The peopling of the Americas is one of the most actively debated topics in all of archaeology. The traditional model held that the first Americans crossed from Siberia into Alaska via a land bridge exposed during the Ice Age, then spread southward through the continent as the ice retreated. But evidence accumulated over the past few decades has complicated that model considerably. Sites in South America appear to show human occupation earlier than the traditional timeline allows. Coastal migration routes have been proposed alongside or instead of the overland corridor. The possibility of multiple distinct waves of migration from different source populations has gained increasing support from genetic research. The physical variation seen in some of the earliest American skeletons, including Naya, adds another layer of complexity to a debate that shows no sign of settling into consensus anytime soon. The 8,000-year-old skeleton from this latest Yucatan discovery sits at a different point in that story. 8,000 years ago is early Holocene, after the end of the Ice Age, after the great megafauna extinctions that reshaped the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, but still thousands of years before the earliest Maya settlements began to appear on the Yucatan Peninsula. The person whose remains were found in that cave was living in a world without agriculture, without cities, and without any of the cultural complexity that would eventually produce the Maya civilization above the same stretch of ground. They were hunter-gatherers, moving through a landscape that would have been very different from the jungle that covers the peninsula today, hunting animals, gathering plants, and navigating a world that left almost no written record. Finding their remains in the cave system adds another point of evidence to the limited but growing body of knowledge about who was living in this part of Mesoamerica in the deep past. Each skeleton recovered from the Yucatan caves represents an individual who walked through those passages when they were still dry, and whose life and death can tell researchers something about the populations that preceded the better-known cultures of the region. The caves have become an increasingly important archaeological resource precisely because of how well they preserve organic material that would have decayed long ago anywhere else. Bone survives in these conditions when it would not survive in the jungle above. DNA analysis of the newly discovered skeleton is currently underway. The results of that analysis are likely to attract significant attention from researchers working on early American population history because every new ancient genome from this period and region adds data to a picture that remains incomplete. Depending on what the DNA shows, this individual could contribute new evidence to debates about migration routes, population relationships, and the genetic diversity of early Mesoamerican communities. Ongoing cave diving surveys across the Yucatan system are also continuing to locate new remains and artifacts in the deeper and less explored sections of the network, and the expectation among researchers working in this field is that the caves have considerably more to give up before their full story is known. Above the waterline, the jungle grows and the ruins of the great Maya cities attract visitors from around the world. Below it, In the cold and the dark of the flooded passages, the much older history of this peninsula is still being found, one careful dive at a time. From the flooded caves of the Yucatan, we travel to a very different kind of ancient site. No water, no jungle, no buried city, just an open hillside in southern Greece, and a find that pushed the story of human capability back by over 100,000 years. In January, researchers announced a discovery made at a site called Marathusa, one in the central Peloponnese region of Greece. The study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in February, led by Annemieke Milks, and a large international team drawn from institutions including the University of Tübingen and research centers in Athens. What they had found at Marathusa, 1, was evidence for the earliest known use of wooden handheld tools by any member of the human family, dated to approximately 430,000 years ago. To put that number in perspective, 430,000 years ago is before both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals existed as separate species. The hominins using these tools belonged to an earlier group, most likely Homo heidelbergensis, or a closely related population, a species that researchers believe was the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. These were not people like us. And yet, on a hillside in Greece nearly 500,000 years ago, they were picking out pieces of wood, shaping them, and using them as tools in ways that left traces a research team could identify and date hundreds of thousands of years later. The find matters so much partly because of how rarely this kind of evidence survives. Organic materials decay. Wood, bone, plant fiber, leather, almost everything our ancient relatives made from natural materials other than stone has been lost over time. The archaeological record for early hominins is dominated by stone tools, not because stone was necessarily the most important material they used, but because stone lasts across hundreds of thousands of years, where almost nothing else does. What we see in the fossil record is a filtered version of the past, one where the durable things have survived and the perishable things are gone. Wooden tools almost never make it, which means that every time they do turn up, they are showing us something the stone record simply cannot. Before Marathusa 1, the oldest wooden tools ever found were the Schöningen spears, a collection of wooden throwing and thrusting weapons recovered from a lignite mine in northern Germany in the 1990s and dated to around 300,000 years ago. The Schöningen spears were already a landmark discovery when they were found, demonstrating clearly that hominins of that period were making well-designed wooden hunting weapons with carefully shaped shafts and balanced forms. They changed how researchers thought about what early hominins were capable of and pushed back the evidence for wooden tool use by a significant margin. Marathusa 1 now pushes that evidence back by another 100,000 years on top of that. The site itself has been under investigation for several years and has already built up a good record of hominin activity from the Middle Pleistocene, the broad geological period running from roughly 780,000 to 126,000 years ago. What makes the site particularly striking is the context in which the wooden tool evidence was found. The tools are associated with the butchered remains of straight-tusked elephants, known scientifically as Paleoloxodon antiquus, one of the largest land animals in Europe during this period. These were not small animals. Straight-tusked elephants were bigger than modern African elephants, with tusks that could grow to over 4 meters in length. Dealing with an animal of that size, whether through hunting or scavenging a carcass, was not something that happened by accident. The connection between the wooden tools and the elephant remains raises questions the team is still working through. Were the hominins at Marathusa one actively hunting these animals, or were they coming across carcasses and processing them after the fact? Both options have been proposed for similar sites elsewhere in Europe, and neither has been ruled out here. But either way, having wooden tools present in that situation tells us something meaningful. Whether the tools were used in the hunt itself or in breaking down the carcass afterward, using them required planning. Selecting a piece of wood, shaping it into something useful, and deploying it for a specific task is not a simple or automatic behavior. It requires the ability to picture what you need before you have it, and to work through the steps to get there. That kind of forward thinking was not something older models of early hominin behavior tended to credit to species this ancient. The study of early hominin cognition has changed a great deal over the past few decades, and it has changed consistently in one direction. Discovery after discovery has pushed back the dates for behaviors that were once considered much more recent. Controlled use of fire has been documented at sites over 400,000 years old. Evidence of pigment use and possible symbolic behavior keeps turning up earlier and earlier. The Schoningen spears showed that complex wooden weapon making was happening 300,000 years ago. Each of these finds has moved the picture of early human capability further back in time, and Marathouse 1 is the latest and most striking example of that pattern continuing. What this discovery changes most directly is the timeline for wood being used deliberately as a primary tool material. Before this find, the evidence pointed to sophisticated wood use becoming established around 300,000 years ago, roughly when Neanderthals were beginning to emerge as a distinct group. The Marathouse 1 evidence pushes that back to a time when the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans was still alive, which suggests that the capacity for this kind of thinking and making was inherited by both groups rather than developed separately by either one. That has implications not just for how we understand Homo heidelbergensis, but for the deeper roots of the skills that both Neanderthals and modern humans would later show in very different ways. It is also a reminder of how much of the past we are still missing. If wooden tools were being made and used 430,000 years ago, the practice almost certainly goes back even further. The evidence at Marathouse 1 survived because of a specific set of site conditions that allowed organic material to last long enough to be found and dated. How many other moments of early hominin woodworking and toolmaking have simply gone without leaving a trace is something that cannot be answered. What can be said is that every time the right conditions exist for organic evidence to survive, what turns up tends to show a past that was richer and more capable than the stone record on its own would ever suggest. Further excavation at Marathouse 1 is planned, with the team working to build a fuller picture of what was happening there and how the wooden tools fit into the broader pattern of activity at the site. The Peloponnese region as a whole is becoming increasingly well known as a rich area for Middle Pleistocene hominin remains and artifacts, and Marathouse 1 is the latest in a series of finds from the region that have drawn real international attention. Greece, it turns out, has an ancient human story that goes back considerably further than most people realize. Most of the discoveries we have covered so far involve things you can see and touch. Cities, tombs, bones, tools. This next one is different. It comes from a laboratory, from the analysis of ancient DNA pulled from human remains, and what it found inside that genetic material is something that should make all of us sit up a little. In June, Science Daily reported findings from a study in which researchers analyzed ancient DNA from hunter-gatherer cemetery sites in Siberia. What they were looking for, and what they found, was evidence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, and they found it in remains dating back 5,500 years, long before anything that previous research had connected to the conditions needed for plague to spread through human populations. To understand why that date matters so much, it helps to know what plague is and what its history looks like from a human point of view. Plague has caused 3 of the most destructive disease events in recorded history. The Justinianic plague swept through the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world in the 6th century AD, killing millions and shaking one of the great powers of the ancient world to its foundations. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed roughly a third of the entire population of the continent over the years that followed, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide, one of the worst death events in all of human history. Then came the third pandemic, starting in the 19th century in China and spreading globally through shipping routes, killing millions more before modern medicine began to bring it under control. The bacterium behind all 3 of those events, Yersinia pestis, was only identified and named in 1894 by the Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin. working in Hong Kong during the third pandemic. Before that, the cause of plague was unknown, and the disease had moved through human history as a devastating and unexplained force. Since Yerson's identification, and especially since ancient DNA sequencing became widely available in recent decades, researchers have been working backward through the archaeological record, trying to trace how old Yersinia pestis actually is, and how long it has been crossing paths with human populations. Earlier studies had already pushed the presence of the bacterium in human remains back to the Bronze Age, around 5,000 years ago, in some cases, which was already a surprise. The Bronze Age was a time of growing cities, expanding trade, and increasingly dense human settlement, conditions that most researchers had assumed were needed for plague to take hold and spread effectively. Finding it in Bronze Age populations stretched the timeline but still fit within that basic framework. The Siberian hunter-gatherer finding breaks that framework completely. 5,500 years ago, the people whose remains were analyzed were not city dwellers. They were not farmers, packed into dense agricultural settlements. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small, spread-out groups across the Siberian landscape, moving with the seasons and the animals they depended on. Everything previously thought to be needed for plague to establish itself, the crowding, the rats, the grain stores, the close-packed urban communities, none of it was present. And yet Yersinia pestis was there. How the disease was actually moving through a hunter-gatherer population, and what it looked like in that setting, is something researchers do not yet fully understand. The classic picture of plague, the bubonic form carried by flea bites from infected rats to people living on top of each other in cramped conditions, probably does not apply here. The bacterium may have been spreading through different routes entirely and causing a different pattern of illness in people whose lives looked nothing like those of medieval European city dwellers. Working out the mechanism is one of the main questions that follow-up research will need to address. What the finding does make clear is that the relationship between humans and Yersinia pestis is much older and more complicated than the historical record ever suggested. The three great plague pandemics that tore through historical civilizations were not the beginning of the story. They were later chapters in a relationship between this pathogen and our species that was already underway thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down, before most cities existed, and before the conditions that were supposed to make plague possible were in place anywhere in the world. That raises a question which is hard to answer but worth asking. If plague was present in human populations 5,500 years ago, what was it doing to those populations? The historical pandemics are documented well enough that researchers can estimate death tolls and trace the spread. The prehistoric period leaves no such record, but the genetic and archaeological evidence from the Neolithic and early Bronze Age does contain signs of dramatic population collapses in various parts of Europe and Asia, events where the genetic signature of entire regional groups seems to vanish or get replaced within a relatively short window of time. Disease has been put forward as one possible cause alongside climate change, migration, and conflict. The new timeline for Yersinia pestis makes that explanation more worth taking seriously, and researchers are now actively looking for traces of the bacterium in burial sites from regions and periods where these kinds of population disruptions have already been documented. The broader field of ancient pathogen research has grown quickly over the past decade as sequencing technology has improved and the costs have come down. Researchers can now screen ancient human remains for a wide range of disease organisms. And what they keep finding is that the dates for human exposure to pathogens we thought of as relatively recent keep getting pushed further back. Yersinia pestis is the most dramatic example yet, but it is unlikely to be the last. Ongoing research across prehistoric burial sites around the world is expected to turn up more early evidence of the bacterium, and the teams working on this are now looking for it in older populations and more varied locations than have been covered so far. The picture of disease in the ancient world is being redrawn, and what is taking shape is a good deal darker and more complex than the one we had before. The last section asked us to rethink what we knew about disease in the ancient world. This one asks us to rethink something even more fundamental: where early humans actually lived and what kinds of environments they were capable of surviving in. In May, Science Daily reported findings from a study that uncovered evidence of ancient humans living in dense rainforest in West Africa, far earlier than science had previously thought possible. It sounds straightforward on paper. In practice, it overturns an assumption that has shaped thinking about early human movement for decades. The traditional picture of how early humans spread across Africa and eventually out into the rest of the world goes roughly like this. Our ancestors followed open environments, grasslands, savannas, and coastlines, using them as natural routes that offered food, clear sightlines, and relatively easy movement. Dense tropical rainforest was seen as something to go around rather than through. The forest floor receives little sunlight. Most of the plant life growing there is not easy to eat without significant processing. Large animals are harder to track and hunt in thick vegetation than in open country. The standard view held that early humans, without modern tools and accumulated knowledge, simply did not have what they needed to live in rainforest for any real stretch of time, and that the great forest belts of Central and West Africa acted as barriers to early human movement rather than places where people built communities. That view has been taking hits for a while. Over the past decade, evidence of early human presence in the rainforests of South and Southeast Asia has been building, with sites in Sri Lanka and Borneo, among others, pushing back the dates for rainforest, living in those regions by tens of thousands of years. Each time, the findings were absorbed into the wider picture without really shaking the Africa-centered version of the story, partly because Africa itself had not yet produced the same kind of evidence. The West African findings change that. The evidence uncovered in West Africa shows humans present and adapted to dense rainforest conditions significantly earlier than the accepted timeline allowed for, in a region sitting at the heart of one of the oldest and most ecologically complex forest environments on the planet. West Africa's rainforests, which cover large parts of the region and connect to the vast Congo Basin further east, are among the richest forest ecosystems anywhere on Earth. They have been forested for an extraordinarily long time, which means they have been a potential human habitat for an extraordinarily long time. The question was always whether early humans were actually using them. The answer, it turns out, is yes, and earlier than anyone had expected. West Africa is also significant from a genetic angle. The populations living there today carry some of the deepest branching lineages in the entire human family tree, meaning their ancestral lines split from other human populations very early in our evolutionary history. West African genetic diversity is remarkable, reflecting a very long and largely continuous human presence in the region across many thousands of years, and yet the archaeological record for early humans in West Africa has historically been much thinner than the record from East Africa, where sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa and a string of East African locations have driven most of the story around early human behavior and capability. Part of that gap reflects genuine differences in the record, but a significant part of it also reflects where research has been concentrated and the real challenges of working in tropical environments where preservation is often poor and access and funding have not always been easy to arrange. The gap between what the genetics tells us about long human habitation in West Africa and what the archaeology has been able to show has been a known issue in the field for years. If people were living in West African rainforests earlier than previously thought, it helps explain some of that gap. Evidence of occupation in forested environments is harder to find and harder to preserve than evidence from open sites. Tools, bones, and other remains break down faster in the wet heat of the forest floor. Sites get buried under thick vegetation and deep layers of leaf matter. The conditions that make rainforests so productive for the animals and plants living in them are exactly the conditions that eat through archaeological evidence over thousands of years, which means that not finding something in these environments has always needed to be treated carefully, and this discovery is a clear example of why. What the find adds to the broader picture of early human capability is another piece of evidence for how flexible and adaptable Homo sapiens were from early in their history. Moving into a dense rainforest and figuring out how to live there is not a simple thing. It requires real, detailed knowledge of the local environment, what is safe to eat, how to move through thick vegetation, where to find clean water, how to read a landscape that offers very few long sightlines. That kind of knowledge gets built up over generations of living in one place and passed down through communities over time. The people whose presence has been documented in these West African forests were not just passing through. They were living there successfully enough to leave a trace that has survived to be found thousands of years later. The implications reach beyond West Africa. If early humans were living in dense tropical rainforest in this region earlier than expected, the question of where else they may have been doing the same becomes considerably more open. The equatorial rainforest belt runs across large parts of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and South America. And there are stretches of all of those regions where early human presence has not been seriously looked for, partly because the old assumption was that the forest made it unlikely. That assumption looks much less solid now. New survey work across other equatorial forest zones is likely to follow from this discovery, as researchers use the West African findings as a reason to look more carefully at environments that were previously passed over. Ongoing excavation at the West African sites is continuing, and the expectation is that more evidence of early human occupation in these forest settings will come out as the work develops. The story of where early humans lived and what they could adapt to keeps getting bigger, and this is one of the clearest examples yet of a find that expands that picture in a direction nobody was fully prepared for. We have spent much of this video looking at discoveries made using cutting-edge technology: DNA sequencing, LiDAR scanning, geophysical surveys, drone mapping. This next one is a reminder that some of the most remarkable finds still come straight out of the ground, and that the English countryside has not finished giving things up yet. In January, CNN and BBC both reported the announcement of a discovery made the previous summer in West Norfolk, England. The find had been made during the warmer months and kept quiet while initial analysis was carried out before the public announcement early in the year. What had come out of the ground was a 2,000-year-old Iron Age hoard, and at the center of it, something that set the find apart from the many other hoards that turn up in British fields every year: a near-complete bronze carnix, one of the rarest objects in all of Celtic archaeology. Most people have never heard of a carnix, which makes it hard to explain straight away why finding one in near-complete condition in a Norfolk field is such a big deal. The carnix was a wind instrument, a kind of horn used across Iron Age Europe during the last few centuries, BC, and into the early centuries, AD. It was not shaped like a modern instrument. The carnix was built to look like an animal, usually a boar or a serpent, with the bell of the instrument forming the open mouth of the creature at the top. The player held it vertically, raising it above the heads of the crowd or the battle line, with the open animal mouth pointed upward and the sound going out and overhead into the air above. Ancient writers who heard it described the sound as harsh, discordant, and deeply unsettling. That was exactly the intention. The carnix was raised above Celtic battle lines to create a wall of noise designed to unnerve and frighten the enemy before fighting began. Julius Caesar and other Roman writers who came up against Celtic armies commented on the sheer noise of their approach, the combined sound of horns, shouts, and war cries rolling ahead of a charge. The carnix was a central part of that. Its image was familiar enough to the Romans that they put it in their own art repeatedly, most famously on Trajan's column in Rome, where Celtic and Dacian warriors are shown holding it aloft, and on the Gundestrup cauldron, the great silver ritual vessel found in Denmark that carries some of the most detailed pictures of Celtic ceremonial life ever found. And yet, despite how well known the carnix was in the ancient world, finding an actual one is extremely rare. The most important example recovered before the Norfolk discovery was the Deskford carnix, found in Scotland in 1778. Only the animal head portion survived, not the full instrument, and even that single fragment is considered one of the most important Celtic objects ever found in Britain. Pieces of carnix bells and fittings have also come out of a hoard at Tentignac in France in 2004. But a near-complete example, one that preserves enough of the instrument to understand its full form and how it was put together, had never been found in Britain before the Norfolk hoard. Alongside the carnix, the hoard contained a metal boar's head flag standard, the kind of object that would have been carried into battle or ceremony as a symbol of a tribe's identity and power. The boar carried enormous weight in Celtic culture. It appears on helmets, shields, coins, brooches, and ceremonial objects right across the Celtic world, from Britain and Ireland through to Central Europe. In Celtic belief, the boar was tied to warfare, strength, feasting, and the sacred, a creature with meaning across multiple areas of life at once. A boar standard carried into battle was not just a flag. It was a statement about who was carrying it, their identity and their relationship to the forces they believed shaped war and fate. The combination of a carnix and a boar standard together in a single deposit is, as far as researchers are aware, without any known parallel in the archaeological record. These kinds of objects turn up individually at various Iron Age sites across Europe, but finding them together in what appears to be a carefully assembled deposit raises real questions about what this hoard was meant to represent and why these particular objects were chosen to go into the ground at the same time. The question of why hoards were buried is something Iron Age archaeology has been thinking about for a long time. The simple explanation that valuable objects were hidden for safekeeping and never retrieved works for some hoards but sits less comfortably with others. Many Iron Age hoards, particularly those containing ritual or ceremonial objects, are now thought to represent deliberate offerings, things placed in the ground as gifts to gods or spirits of the land, rather than savings put aside for later. The objects in these deposits are often among the most valued and carefully made things a community had, which makes the hiding for safekeeping explanation feel weak. You do not bury your most sacred ceremonial objects to keep them from thieves. You bury them because putting them in the earth is the whole point. If the Norfolk carnix hoard was a ritual deposit of this kind, then the carnix and the boar standard were not hidden. They were given, placed in the earth of West Norfolk as part of a ceremony or a moment whose full meaning we can no longer read, but whose physical remains have now come back out of the ground 2,000 years later. Iron Age Britain in the period this hoard dates from was a world of complex tribal politics, strong craft traditions, and real connections to the broader Celtic world across the Channel. The tribes of East Anglia were active players in trade and cultural exchange that stretched into Gaul and beyond. The objects being made and used in this part of Britain were not rough imitations of continental styles. They were high-quality products of a culture that knew exactly what it was doing, and the carnix and boar standard from the Norfolk hoard are strong evidence of that. The carnix alone, in its near-complete state, is one of the most informative examples of the instrument ever recovered anywhere, and the research coming out of the hoard over the next few years is likely to add real depth to what is known about ceremonial and military life in Iron Age Britain. Conservation and detailed analysis of the objects is currently underway, and full publication of the findings is expected in due course. East Anglia has produced important Iron Age finds before, but the Norfolk carnix hoard stands apart, even in that company, and the work being done on it now is only the beginning of what it has to tell us. We began this video in Egypt, with a sealed chamber full of painted coffins and unread papyri. It feels right to end the main run of discoveries there too, with a find that is in some ways the opposite of everything we have covered. Not a single dramatic object or a hidden tomb, but a vast, sprawling archive of everyday life, written on broken pottery and scraps of stone, and buried in the ground of Upper Egypt for over 1,000 years. In March, Ahram Online reported that a joint mission between Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities and the University of Tübingen in Germany had recovered approximately 13,000 inscribed ostraca from the site of Athribis in Sohag Governorate, Upper Egypt. 13,000 from a single site. The scale of that number alone is what makes this discovery stand out, but what is written on those fragments is what gives it its real significance. Ostraca are one of the less glamorous but genuinely important categories of ancient Egyptian material. The word refers to pottery sherds and small pieces of limestone that were used as writing surfaces in daily life. Papyrus was expensive. For most people in ancient Egypt, most of the time, papyrus was not a realistic option for everyday writing. If you needed to jot down a list, record a transaction, write a letter, or note something down quickly, you picked up a piece of broken pot or a chip of limestone and wrote on that instead. Ostraca were the notepads, the receipts, the rough drafts, and the quick notes of the ancient Egyptian world. They were used constantly and in enormous numbers, and because fired pottery and limestone do not decay the way organic materials do, they survive in far greater quantities than papyrus ever has. Every significant ostraca find adds to a picture of daily life in ancient Egypt that the grand temple inscriptions and royal papyri simply cannot provide on their own. 13,000 of them from a single deposit at Athribis is an extraordinary number. To put it in context, major ostraca finds that make news in Egyptology typically involve hundreds of objects, occasionally a few thousand. Finding 13,000 in one place, spanning more than 1,000 years of occupation, is on a different scale entirely, and it places the Athribis archive among the largest single discoveries of written material from ancient Egypt in recent memory. Athribis itself is a site with a long and significant history. Located in Sohag Governorate in Upper Egypt, the town had a continuous period of occupation stretching across multiple historical periods, with temples dating to the Ptolemaic era, when Egypt was ruled by the Greek dynasty that followed Alexander the Great's conquest, through to the Roman period and beyond. The University of Tübingen team has been working at the site for several years and has built up a strong record of finds there, but the 13,000 ostraca represent the most significant single discovery the excavation has produced. The span of the inscriptions is one of the things that makes the archive so valuable. 1,000 years of texts from a single location means the material covers an extraordinary range of historical periods. The late period of ancient Egyptian history, the Ptolemaic era, the Roman occupation, and possibly the early Byzantine period are all potentially represented within the archive. For researchers trying to understand how Egyptian administrative systems, religious practices, and daily life changed or stayed the same across these very different political environments, having 1,000 years of local records from one town is a remarkable resource. Most archives of this kind are either very narrow in their time span or very broad in their geography. The Athribis collection offers unusual depth in a single location across a very long stretch of time. The content of the inscriptions ranges widely across what has been examined so far. Administrative records feature prominently, the kind of accounting, record-keeping, and official documentation that kept ancient towns functioning across any period. Letters and personal communications appear alongside more formal material. And then, there are the texts that attracted particular attention when Science Daily reported on them in May. The anti-witchcraft rituals and protective formulae found among the inscriptions. These kinds of texts, known in academic terms as phylacteries or apotropaic formulae, are not unknown in ancient Egypt, but they are relatively rare in the surviving written record. They represent something quite specific and quite human. Not the official religion of the pharaohs, not the grand theological statements carved into temple walls, but the private fears and hopes of ordinary people, the spells and protective words that individuals sought out when they felt threatened by supernatural forces, when they worried about curses, about malevolent magic being directed at them, about illness or misfortune that seemed to have no natural cause. Anti-witchcraft texts were the response to those fears. Written protections that a person might carry, keep in their home, or deposit somewhere significant as a form of spiritual insurance against harm. Finding material like this in significant quantities within the Athribis archive adds to a growing body of evidence about popular religious practice in ancient Egypt, the lived religion of ordinary people rather than the ceremonial religion of the state. Temple inscriptions and royal documents tell one kind of story about what ancient Egyptians believed and how they practiced their faith. Ostraca with private protective formulae tell a very different and in some ways more immediate one, a story about individual anxiety individual hope, and the kinds of supernatural threats that felt real and present to the people writing those words down on broken pieces of pot in a town in Upper Egypt 2,000 years ago. The full significance of the archive will take years to establish. Translating and publishing 13,000 texts is not a quick process, even with a well-resourced research team working on it. Many of the ostraca will need careful conservation before they can be properly read. Others may turn out to contain material that changes specific areas of research in ways that cannot be predicted until the texts are actually worked through. The University of Tübingen team is continuing its excavation at Athribis, and further finds from the site are expected as the work develops. What can be said now is that the Athribis Ostraca Archive is one of the most significant epigraphic discoveries from Egypt in years, and that its significance has very little to do with gold, royal names, or dramatic burial chambers. It comes from volume, from time depth, and from the simple fact that 13,000 pieces of written stone from a single Egyptian town across 1,000 years of history represent a window into daily life that very few archaeological discoveries anywhere in the world can match. The grand finds get the headlines, and rightly so. But archives like this one are often where the real historical work gets done.